Good afternoon and welcome to the law firm of Venable LLP's Cyber Sticks and Carrots, how the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, Incentives, and the Safety Act may affect you. My name is Jamie Barnett. I'm a partner in the firm's cybersecurity practice and co-chair with Rick Joyce of our telecommunications group. I'm a retired Rear Admiral, and I spent 3 years at the FCC as the chief of the Public Safety Bureau, Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, where I had the privilege of working with those professionals, many professionals across government and industry on 3 major voluntary cybersecurity initiatives. I noticed that several of those people that I worked on that with, both the FCC and elsewhere, are here today. And I came here in February of this year from the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies, where I'm still a senior fellow. So, welcome and thank you for coming, spending your time with us. For those here in the room, and the same to those who are attending on our webcast, we have representatives from several government agencies that have signed up both here and on the webcast, representatives of leaders in industry across communications, banking, energy, transportation, defense, advanced technologies, and many others. We welcome the members of the press, and we've had a great RSVP list across the nation, and even though I shouldn't delve into saying thanks to particular people, it's always good to see one of my mentors from Potomac and FCC, Alan Powler, here, and I know Jim Lewis is on the line, but thank you all for coming. For over 100 years, Venable has provided the knowledge, experience, and innovative solutions for our clients, and Venable has made a commitment to lead in the area of cybersecurity, building on our established and nationally and even internationally recognized practices in privacy and data breach, government contracts, legislative and regulatory work, and spanning the verticals of banking and finance, communications, energy, transportation, advanced technologies, and many others. We include in that cybersecurity companies. In March, Venable presented a similar form to this on the Executive Order 13636, which was signed in February of this year, to kind of let you know what the process would be and what you could expect in the ensuing months. Well, now, 7 months later, we would like to report to you what's happened in that process so far, how the cybersecurity framework, the incentives, and what is maybe to come along can affect you, and really what you can do right now. Our idea is to inform you of information you can actually use. While we hope it's very academic, we don't want it to only be academic. The cybersecurity framework, and really EO 13636, was born out of a critical need for action on cybersecurity in the face of no legislation being adopted and none that really seems likely, at least in the short term. Clearly, with the tremendous number of cyber attacks, the strength and persistence and duration, the status quo was not acceptable. Everyone generally recognizes that government has a role to play in cybersecurity, but agreement generally evaporates very quickly after that when defining that role. EO 13636 and the framework addressed this challenge by pushing the envelope on information sharing, enhancing privacy oversight, and with a system of progressive improvements for cybersecurity for companies, incentivized by methods currently available to the executive branch and the private sector, so the carrots, so to speak, or encouraged by requirements in RFPs and government contracting, which may be a stick, maybe a carrot. The EO does not count out the possibility of additional regulation, and since no legislation is at least on the horizon immediately, those industries which are already regulated may have some concern about what this may be. The executive order and the cyber framework have created a great dialogue and collaboration. However, when they're complete, I don't think anybody will say that that's all that needs to be done. Ultimately, legislation will be needed, and a concept for the role of the government must be agreed to, or we'll really never reach the level of cybersecurity that we need. And to date, generally, I would say, industry has said we don't want any legislation because we don't want any new requirements. But let me suggest a couple of principles that we can kick around either today or afterwards about what comes after the cyber framework and what needs to be done and to even make it more effective. The first principle I would say is that the cybersecurity fight is in the private sector. The Internet is not owned or operated by the government, and it shouldn't be. But the government must play a supporting role. The second principle is that if government is to play a supporting role, then it must incentivize the private sector to vastly improve its game in the national interest. Security costs money, and the market is not producing, I would think we would say, the sufficient level of security in the security market at this point. Government must be willing to invest in the private sector of cybersecurity. Perhaps that's through tax incentives, credit deductions, limitations of liability, all the while ensuring privacy rights for American citizens. In this era of severe budget constriction and, quite frankly, controversy, this may seem unachievable. And I think it will remain unachievable until industry maybe reverses its current strategy, saying we don't want any legislation, and we come together around something that actually helps pay for what must be done. Until that time, the framework has key implications for us now and really in the near future, and that is what our guest speakers will talk about today. So just a little bit about what will happen then. We have two of our outstanding Venable attorneys who will give you a short, it's maybe 10 minutes or less, on the topics of the NIST workshops and the cyber framework, and then even something you can do now, which is the Safety Act. Even before the framework's adopted, this is something that's available to you now. And then we'll have our main event, the reason why you really came or signed up for this. We're going to hold questions to the end if that's all right, but we have allowed time for you to ask briefly stated questions here, and I'll remind you this, but we have microphones that will come around if you would state your name. For those of you that are on the webcast, you can also ask questions. If you would, you can even send them now if you want to. If you would send them to events with an S? Events at Venable.com. And so we may not have time for all of the questions, but to the degree we can, if they're written for us, we will certainly try to get them answered if they're not answered here. So with that, I'd like to move to our first speaker, who has attended every one of the NIST workshops. That's part of the commitment that Venable has made to the cybersecurity arena. Jason Wool is one of our outstanding lawyers. He practices, his practice focuses on electric and other utility regulations at the state and federal level. He specifically focused most of his career on ISOs and RTOs and on the reliability compliance, as well as a variety of other issues that appear before or go before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. So he describes himself as a FERC nerd guy. So outstanding attorney that graduated from William Mary School of Law. And if you would now please welcome Jason Wool.
Thanks, Jimmy. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming. I am excited to be speaking on this event after having attended all of these workshops and spent a lot of time thinking about what the framework would actually look like when it was first announced, etc. And I'm also even more pleased to have Secretary Lute sharing the stage with me, or rather to be sharing the stage with her, I should say. Let's get the first slide going. Okay. So as Jamie mentioned, the executive order came out in February of this year, and we've already done an event on it, and there's a lot of material out there, so I'm not going to spend much time talking about the EO itself. What I'd like to say is that if you would like more information about the EO, please feel free to email me, and I will send you the materials that we have been working on and that I have available for distribution. The one thing about the EO that I do want to remark on and remind everyone about is the definition of critical infrastructure that it uses. And it's taken, I believe, from the USA Patriot Act. So it defines critical infrastructure as systems and assets, whether physical or virtual, so vital to the United States that the incapacity or destruction of such systems or assets would have a debilitating impact on security, national economic security, national public health or safety, or any combination of those matters. In the workshops, we have repeatedly gone back to that definition as a reminder of not just the gravity of what we're talking about, but the scope of the framework and what it's addressing. So just as some more high-level information, the EO directs NIST the National Institute of Standards and Technology, to develop a framework to reduce cyber risks to critical infrastructure. It provides very broad parameters in this regard. In other words, it says it needs to be prioritized, flexible, repeatable, performance-based, and cost-effective. Those are very broad, and I have to say that they haven't necessarily, they're a little too broad, perhaps. Sorry, I just want to get my my timer back. So NIST, in furtherance of this goal, NIST has held 4 workshops, with the last of which was in Dallas just recently, and I was there. And when we were there, we were discussing the current state of the framework. Right now, the framework has 5 core functions, which are know, detect, prevent, respond, and recover. And these are the intended outcomes of the implementation. In other words, those are what you are being directed to achieve through implementation of the framework. It also outlines several categories and subcategories of those functions, which eventually point to existing standards, and that's a very important point. It's not providing any new way to accomplish these security goals. It's saying here are a number of ways that are already in existence and that are proven that you can use to achieve these goals. And I would also add that it's also up to you which informative reference, as they're called, to adopt. It also provides a profile system for assessing your maturity, and that is also intended to be used in comparing your company's maturity level and in the various functions that I described to other companies across sectors. So it's aiming to provide a sort of common language of risk, if you will. The EO also directs DHS to establish a voluntary program to support the adoption of the cybersecurity framework. And that is where the incentives come in. The voluntary program would be where companies agree to adopt the framework, and the incentives are the carrots that are meant to draw them into that program. And so what I'd like to do now is discuss some of the incentives that we've seen. So the executive order has directed DHS to oversee the development of incentives, but it also asked the Departments of Commerce, Treasury, and DHS itself to provide recommendations on these incentives to the White House. And those were submitted, actually I'm not sure the exact date they were submitted, but the White House put out a blog post on August 6th in which it discussed all of these different reports and selected the ones that it thought were most promising. And actually, if you look in the packet, there is an Excel spreadsheet that I've put in there that is comparing all of the different incentives recommendations, and it has X's to show which ones were shared by the different recommendation reports. So some of the most promising incentives. The first one that I think is particularly interesting is the recommendation that most, if not all, of the reports made to collaborate with the insurance industry. That's a really important one because obviously it doesn't require much federal government involvement. It's market-driven. We like that. But it's also unclear what role the government would play in this incentive, and therefore how it would actually be an incentive if it's already there and whatnot. But the Department of Commerce, for instance, said this collaboration with the government, between the government and the insurance industry, could serve as a basis for creating underwriting practices that promote the adoption of cyber risk-reducing measures and risk-based pricing. Basically, I think the idea is that the framework could provide a baseline that would be necessary for that insurance markets need in order to compare basically enterprise risk amongst different companies in different sectors. So again, returning to that theme of common language of risk, that's something that the framework can provide. Another thing to mention there about insurance, however, I wouldn't call it a downside, but cybersecurity insurance is pretty much recognized as being in its infancy. And in fact, at the Dallas NIST workshop, there was a couple references to the fact that there's a lack of actuarial data on catastrophic cyber attacks, which means that really large coverage policies aren't necessarily available right now. So you can get coverage, and it requires you to make a demonstration of sufficient cybersecurity practices, I would mention. But for really large policies, it's not necessarily clear that those are going to be available because the data is just not there. Tax is often mentioned as an incentive in this context, but tax was specifically rejected in several of the reports, and the White House did not include it. I'm not particularly sure of why that was. I don't think that the reasons that were provided were so clear. But I think basically at the end of the day, the federal government doesn't think that it's possible to get a tax incentive passed, or they don't want to foot the bill. But it's not on the table at the moment. Another incentive that was mentioned was technical assistance or expedited government service delivery. Again, those are attractive because no legislation would be needed. And there's a little more information in the spreadsheet about what those would look like. The next one is rate recovery. Obviously, that is most attractive to regulated industries such as electric, where I work. But again, it's unclear whether the states, in particular the state corporation commissions and public utility commissions, have actually been engaged on this question. I've spoken to some people in those areas, and they did not feel that they had been yet. So that's an interesting question about whether that incentive is really realistic at this point. And then finally, the one that we're here today to talk about is liability limitation. I believe all of the reports mentioned liability limitation. However, almost all of them recommended specifically that it be studied, not that it be made available. That's one downside of the issue. Treasury recommended or suggested that that the research be into whether adopting the framework through the voluntary program could serve as a standard of conduct for or minimum acceptable level of systems integrity and precautions. That's an interesting note because the idea of this framework serving as a standard of care of some kind sort of is lurking in the background, and that was, an explicit acknowledgement of that fact in the report. There's also been suggestions that that legislation could provide a statutory defense as a means of, sort of along the lines of the Safety Act, as a means of limiting liability. One suggestion was a statutorily provided safe harbor. Another was a rebuttable presumption that a critical infrastructure entity has taken sufficient action under the circumstances. The same report also expressed concern, however, about moral hazard. In other words, that the fact that companies would be insured would cause them to be slightly more reckless than they might be otherwise. DHS itself recommended bundling insurance requirements with liability protections and legal benefits. I think that's very interesting and attractive, and it also it resembles the current structure of the Safety Act, which I think that's already been a proven mechanism for limiting liability. So DHS has expressed an interest in something similar. Again, the main fallback about or the main downside of limiting liability is that it would require legislation, and that's something that I'll talk about a little bit later. But that's something to keep in mind. There's been a lot of debate and many questions at the NIST workshops about limitation or about incentives in general. At the last one in particular, there were a lot of questions about whether these incentives for the voluntary program are meant to incentivize participation in that program, or whether they're meant to reward improvement over time in that program, or both. There weren't a lot of answers there on that. Another question that I myself have as a NERC lawyer was the question of whether some kind of demonstration of compliance would be required, or whether third-party audits perhaps would be necessary in order to show that the executive orders framework has been implemented sufficiently to justify certain incentives. Will the incentives that do not require legislation be sufficient to incentivize participation and/or improvement? That's another big question. The ones that don't require legislation, while attractive, may not be, big enough to justify the dollar expense of adopting the framework. Will the use of market-based incentives encourage adoption of the framework if they are otherwise available, such as insurance? I think that's a big question. If there is an insurance market that's getting more and more mature, do we really need these incentives in order to get companies to implement robust cybersecurity practices? I'm sorry, I lost my place. On Monday, DHS also held a working group meeting of the first working group meeting of the voluntary program to adopt the framework, and they said at that meeting that these questions essentially remain unanswered. So I just want to point that out. With regard to liability, the executive order, I would say, did not create liability by any means, but it increases the risk for critical infrastructure owners and operators that do not implement robust cybersecurity programs. It essentially has brought everyone's attention to this issue, and that obviously has repercussions. I believe that it would be difficult at this point, in light of the executive order, to deny that the potential harm that could be caused by a cyber attack is foreseeable, especially if you have been designated as a greatest risk critical infrastructure owner or operator under Section 9 of the executive order. And I would cite you back to the definition of critical infrastructure again on that point. The executive order has also brought about a new level of engagement with regard to this topic by executives and boards. And understanding that cyber risk is a form of business risk it's a growing understanding, I believe. And in this sense, the executive order has greatly succeeded. But the SEC has also stated, for instance, that risk oversight is a key competence of the board, and this means that owners and operators are now on notice, which has its own liability implications. Some examples of third-party liability that could result from cyber attacks and that could now possibly have repercussions for companies that even if they do implement the framework. Cyber attacks can theoretically cause kinetic-type damage, we now know. Project Aurora, which was which showed that a cyber attack could cause a turbine to spin out of control. Stuxnet affected programmable logic controllers. We know that cyber attacks can affect the real world. ICS, industrial control systems, which a lot of critical infrastructure owners and operators use. Basically, the message in Dallas from a speaker on this topic was that with these types of computer systems, tangible assets are in play. So we obviously see real-world repercussions with regard to liability. Business operations could be temporarily crippled by certain cyber attacks. We saw that with Shamoon and 30,000 computers being wiped by a virus. And such incidents could result in suits for breach of contract, negligence, shareholder suits, etc. So I say this not to scare you, but to mention that, just to point out that this liability does exist, and yet in order to get liability limitation specifically tailored to the executive order and the cybersecurity framework is not likely. Legislation is probably not going to happen. Even the existing cybersecurity bills that have been introduced are they're looking like they're not going to happen this year. And moreover, the topic of liability limitation with regard to torts and contract breaches and whatnot is rarely discussed on the Hill. The concept of liability limitation is mostly discussed in the concept with regard to information sharing. And so, with that said, to lead up to my colleague Diz Locaria, what we wanted to point out today is that, yes, this liability may exist, or the potential for such liability may exist. No, there probably isn't going to be new legislation to provide any tort or contractual indemnification or liability limitation, but the Safety Act, which is an existing statute, already offers a form of liability limitation that could be utilized by critical infrastructure owners and operators right now. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Jason. I do think it was interesting that Michael Daniels first out of the box on his blog, he did mention cybersecurity insurance first among them. So I do think that it's a non-cost of the government benefit to industry to have it that way. Dismas Locaria, known to his partners as Diz Locaria, is an outstanding partner in our government contract section. He counsels numerous folks with regard to contracting work with the federal government. And in this particular case, he has developed a specialty, I think, our kind of in-house expert on the thing that Jason Wool mentioned, the Safety Act, an existing statute right now that offers certain protections that are now, we're starting to think about how they would apply to the cybersecurity arena. If you would please welcome Diz Locaria.
Thank you, Jamie, and thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon, and Secretary Lute for joining us as well. As Jason mentioned, and Jamie as well, I specialize in something called the Safety Act, which is a little-known statute that came around as a result of the Homeland Security Bill in 2002. To date, there's about 900 technologies that have received Safety Act protections, and those generally apply to products and services, all of which are designed to defend against, mitigate, or respond to terrorist incidents. The whole idea of the Safety Act was to encourage companies to bring to market anti-terrorism technologies, which included both products, services, devices, but arguably cyber-related products as well. Cyber terrorism is probably one aspect of cyber, but an important aspect, and as Jason mentioned, could result in significant liability. So the Safety Act is something that's in play now that can help companies at least be one of the tools in your toolbox of mitigating and limiting risk that you may face in the event of a cyber incident. The Safety Act, as I mentioned, applies to terrorism. I'm just going to go through it really quickly. And there's a definition. It's a three-pronged definition. First, it needs to be unlawful. Often penetrations of your information systems is unlawful. It needs to cause harm, which doesn't only include physical harm, but can also include financial harm. And then it also needs to be something that attempts to use or intends to cause mass destruction, injury to the citizens or the United States. And again, injury includes not only physical harm, but financial harm as well. So it is a somewhat broad definition that a lot of things could fit into. And again, cyber terrorism is something that would fit naturally into that definition. The regulations specifically provide that domestic terrorism is one of the forms of terrorism that would be considered. It doesn't only need to be international terrorism. And there are some extraterritorial aspects of the Act as well, because you have U.S. air carriers, U.S. flagships, U.S. operations overseas, and should those attacks occur at those facilities, at those airlines, carriers, whatever it might be overseas, and the harm comes back to the United States, certainly that also falls under the Act. So just to talk a little bit about the Act, it provides 3 levels of protection. The highest level of protection is called certification, and I'll get into what the benefits are of these levels. But essentially, certification requires that you be able to establish a high degree of confidence in its efficacy. The next level, the step down from certification, is called designation. Designation, you need to demonstrate a showing of effectiveness, not the same high degree, but a level of effectiveness. And then there's also a third for companies that are bringing to market developmental technologies, where you can say that the effectiveness is still being worked out, but for the time being, we need to have some kind of protection in order to bring this product, to allow this product to mature as we bring it to the market. So the benefits of the Safety Act are significant. Certification, the primary benefit of certification, it has all the benefits of designation, but the primary benefit of certification is actually provides immunity from third-party liability. So in situations where you have either physical or financial harm, third-party liability you're immunized from that. So that's a tremendous benefit. It's something that insurance companies look at when they decide premiums. We've known insurance companies to provide premium discounts for companies that have certification. So it is obviously a tremendous benefit. Not an easy thing to obtain. You have to have that high level, but it is something that's available. Designation provides, conversely to an immunization, it provides a cap of your liability. Again, something very interesting and beneficial to companies. Not the same as it is to insurance companies, because insurance companies are still going to be on the hook, but at least it's limited and companies can plan for what liabilities might be out there. And that cap is usually set at some kind of insurance level determined by the Office of Safety Act Implementation and DHS. There's a host of other benefits: exclusive federal jurisdiction, joint and several liability, prohibition on certain recovery claims. Again, all benefits that companies would realize under designation. And then the developmental technology has the same benefits as designation, just a shorter period. It's only good for a 3-year period, whereas designation and certification are 5-year protections that you then can renew after every 5 years. So how does one go about obtaining the Safety Act? In very short order here, you want to analyze what you have. In cyber, it's a little interesting because in cybersecurity right now, there's not a lot of standards to go on. That's kind of what Jason was talking about, is they're developing this framework. So what is DHS and the Office of Safety Act implementation? How are they supposed to say, well, your product or your system, your methodology is effective? Well, you need to have some baseline. And that's what the framework is hopefully going to provide for companies as they start to bring products out and as companies start to implement cyber programs, is they'll have a baseline to go against and then demonstrate efficacy against that baseline. So first you need to examine what you have, you need to document that, and you need to maybe take appropriate enhancements. And then you go to the application. It's a paper application process. You complete the application. It's not a simple application. It takes many hours, but it's an application process, and then you submit to the Office of Safety Act implementation. They then have 30 days to decide whether your application is quote-unquote complete, and then they have another 90 days to make a decision on the application. That whole process is only 120 days. You figure 4 months for protections like this, it's well worth its time and energy. So while the Safety Act, I'm not espousing it to be an end-all, be-all to cyber risk. It is certainly an arrow in your quiver defending against one type of cyber risk that folks face, and certainly something that companies should think about moving forward. But with that, I'll turn it back over to Jamie.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Diz. Diz, thank you. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our main speaker. Dr. Jane Hall-Lute is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Council on Cybersecurity, and as such, she's responsible for the overall direction and activities of that organization. Dr. Lute most recently served as Deputy Secretary for the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, as the department's Chief Operating Officer. Ms. Lute was responsible for the day-to-day management of the department's efforts to prevent terrorism. You can count these if you want to prevent terrorism, enhance security, secure and manage the nation's borders, administer and enforce U.S. immigration laws, strengthen national resilience on the face of disasters, and ensure the nation's cybersecurity. 22 agencies she had oversight over. From 2003 to 2009, Dr. Lute served as the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, responsible for comprehensive on-the-ground support to UN peace operations worldwide, including rapid response efforts in support of development and humanitarian operations in crises. Ms. Lute also served as Assistant Secretary General for peace building, responsible for coordinating the efforts on behalf of the Secretary General to build sustainable peace in countries emerging from violent conflict. Prior to joining the UN, Ms. Lute was Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the United Nations Foundation, the Better World Fund, and worked with David Hamburg, former president of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and Cyrus Vance, former U.S. Secretary of State, on the Carnegie Commission for Preventing Deadly Conflict, a global initiative that pioneered the cause of conflict prevention. Ms. Lute served on the National Security Council staff under both George H.W. Bush and President William Jefferson Clinton, and had a distinguished career in the United States Army, including service in the Gulf during Operation Desert Storm. She has a Ph.D. in political science from Stanford University and a J.D. from Georgetown University. So this is the academic part that I mentioned to you. I'm going to let her tell you a little bit more about the Council on Cybersecurity, but would you please help me welcome a great American, Jane Hall-Lute.
Jamie, thank you very much. We really need to shorten that bio. And thank you all for being here. Your presence at a luncheon discussion on cybersecurity tells me, and it should tell each of you something, that you are still pioneers in a field that has not yet taken hold operationally. We think we understand a little bit more about cybersecurity from an academic or theoretical point of view. We think we understand it a little bit more from a policy point of view, but we need to understand it more from an operational point of view. And for that to happen, that means the technologists and the policymakers and the decision makers need to come together and need to start speaking in a language that each understand. So how many of you in this room actually can affect or change policy in your organization at a strategic level? Not too many. How many of you would consider yourselves to be technologists? A few more. And how many of you have been given responsibility for cybersecurity or for cybersecurity-related things in your firm? A lot more. And how many of you are hungry? Well, this is a little bit part of the challenge that we all face. How do we bring together the communities that actually know what the problem is and how to talk about it with those who know and have the authority to do something about it? I'm at heart an operator, so I'm really interested not only in what we know and in what we understand, but in what we do about what we know. And that fundamentally is what needs to come together in cybersecurity. So we're going to talk a little bit about it. But before I do that, I want to set a little context for you, because cyber is a word that's been floating around a lot. It means different things to different people. So for some people, it means sort of anything electronic. We used to talk about, communications and IT as if they were separate things. So in a very real way, cyber has mashed up those two fields into a single field now. Although, interestingly, I think there are some important divergences recurring, so what's old is new again. But let me set some context. Over the past 5 years, I think we've all been witness to what I've been calling a global cyber awakening. And that global cyber awakening is accompanying the nearly instantaneous and organic expansion of the Internet. So every minute, 100 connections are made on the Internet globally. Globally, there's about a 30% penetration of the world's population by the Internet, about 30% of 7 billion plus people. In North America, it's northwards of 80%, Australia as well. In Europe, over 70%. In Latin America, well over 40%, and growing globally. We see trillions of transactions every single day, billions of users connecting to information and to each other in real time. This is a phenomenon of scale and speed that really is more suited to science than policy making, but it is the reality of the global cyber awakening. And that awakening really is, we've experienced it, each of us. Do you mean to tell me I can just go look it up? The answer is yes, you can. So what does that mean? Well, I think there are three important implications. I mean, we're operating at the speed of light with relative ease across geographical, cultural, socioeconomic, and generational divides. Cyberspace has brought this enormously interesting and empowering combination of information and connection to billions of people. This intersection of information and connection is what I call the global cyber awakening. In less than 10 years, 1 billion people have joined Facebook. Yahoo's not far behind. There are only 2 countries on the planet that have 1 billion or more citizens, India and China. And neither of those countries knows its citizens as well as Facebook and Yahoo knows their users. So part of the cyber awakening is that for a population, a global population that is already healthier, wealthier, mobile, more educated, aware, and active than at any previous in history, this empowerment through cyberspace is a force to be reckoned with. And I think 3 things are worth paying attention to. Number one, while we have come to learn a lot about people in cyberspace and people on the Internet, we understand them almost entirely as consumers. And that's interesting because your government understands you mostly as citizens. We don't understand people on the Internet yet as citizens. We've seen a few glimmers of this in the Middle East, for example, but broadly our understanding of people online is as consumers. That's important to me. It's curious because as consumers, we don't demand security as a first-order proposition. As citizens, we do. When you ask citizens, and I've done it a lot lately, what, if anything, is your government good for? You have to brace yourself. You sort of really need nerves of steel when you're asking that question. The first thing people sort of say is security. I expect my government to provide security, and that's right. Security is typically something that citizens assign or people assign to their governments to handle. We want safe streets. Governments, you run the police. We want a safe country. Governments, you make the laws, you make the treaties, you run the military. So governments are used to being monopolists in security space in a positive sense because societies have broadly, certainly in the West, given governments that responsibility. And that's widely true in physical space. It is absolutely not true in cyberspace. The second thing I think that's kind of worth knowing is that the law, sort of always a lagging indicator, right? But the law is neither guardian nor guide here. The law is not helping us make sense of life online, of life in cyberspace. And that's true. You could see this a little bit in the discussion that we had before about the role that NIST is playing in the process as a result of the executive order. And I'll talk a little bit about what the administration was trying to achieve with that, with the executive order and what the NIST process is designed to do. And in the Safety Act. The Safety Act is an effort to create a law so that those who are innovating technology and services for the protection of our society against terrorism will achieve a certain level of indemnification if they achieve a certain level of performance. It was not originally designed for everyone who fears that they might be subject to a terrorist attack to be protected. So the law is not really functioning well as either a guardian, or a guide for us in cyberspace, and we need to get more serious about that. I'm more optimistic that we will see cyber legislation in our lifetime. Maybe beyond that, I won't define. The real strength of the law lies in its ability to anticipate the familiar and rationalize the unprecedented. That's really what the law does. But in almost every dimension of our cyber existence, while a lot feels like it ought to be familiar, a lot more is really brand new. What does property mean in cyberspace? What does it mean to own something? What does it mean to have rights in something, not only with respect to that thing, but with respect to everyone else? What does contract actually mean in cyberspace? What is reliance? All of these concepts that undergird the institutionalized understanding that we have of the law in this country, and in my view, it's one of the finest traditions that we have as Americans, really are, we're in unfamiliar territory in cyberspace. The law has always been a lagging indicator of social consensus, but it's really behind the curve in cyberspace. And it's not keeping up with technology, society, or policy, quite frankly. Power and practice are filling the void. And so, as we say, in cyberspace, it seems like it's every man or mandiant for themselves. I think the third thing worth noticing is that commercial actors have become powerful in cyberspace and think now about power in cyberspace. I'll come back to that. But the commercial actors in cyberspace that have become powerful have become so largely because they have understood and harnessed the magic of data liquidity. Governments have not yet done that across the board or anywhere approaching the extent to which the private sector has done that. And that leads me to a fundamental question that I've been wrestling with. It seems to me, maybe not a question, let me posit it as an assertion, it's the power to connect, not the power to protect, that matters in cyberspace. So when we look at criminals and other malefactors in cyberspace, we know that they've become powerful largely because most of us are willing to trade convenience and connection for safety and protection when we're online. It's a false choice, of course, but it's one that's led, I think, in part to bad habits all around. But I don't think we can either explain our problem with cybersecurity right now simply as a matter of bad habits. It's too glib. We're not stepping up universally to the responsibilities that we have in cyberspace, and that must change. So over the past 4.5 or 5 years, when we were looking at the cybersecurity mission in Homeland Security, and maybe it's worth spending a minute on how we got to that. When the Obama administration first came in, we were given the responsibility to write the first ever quadrennial Homeland Security Review, the QHSR. And so we wrote it in two parts. We actually did a bottom-up review of the department as a second part, but the first part that we did was write and say, what does it mean to talk about Homeland Security? What are we trying to do? And what we narrated was the following. The purpose of Homeland Security is to help create a safe, secure, resilient place where the American way of life can thrive. And every word, not poetry, I get it, right? But every word in that sentence is important. A safe, secure, resilient place where the American way of life can thrive. What do we need to do? What do we need to do as a government? What do we need to do as a people to ensure our homeland security? We said we need to do 5 things and do them well. We need to prevent another 9/11. We need to secure our borders. We need to administer and enforce our immigration laws. We need to build national resilience, and we need to ensure the cybersecurity of the nation's critical infrastructure, because cyberspace, the internet, is the endoskeleton of modern life. We couldn't have gotten here today without intersecting at some point or having some dependency online, whether it was for metro directions or placing phone calls or any other feature of modern life. So that's why we called it out in Homeland Security. And we said that it was critical. So it's a false choice to say that we either have convenience or we have security. And when we looked in the Obama administration at how to build out an architecture for cybersecurity, for security online, Jamie characterized the debate very accurately. On the one hand, were those who say the government should have nothing to do with this, let the market handle it. The market will equilibrate and get it basically right. Really? I don't think there's anyone in this room who believes that. We don't leave anything to the market exclusively to handle. We do, though, assign some responsibility to market interaction to equilibrate things, but nothing in our lives today is exclusively relegated to the market to manage. There are those on the other end of the spectrum who said, no, it's so dangerous out there. It's really almost like a war zone, that only the government can protect you. Only the government should protect you. Give this job to the government to handle. In our view in Homeland Security, both views were wrong, not only inaccurate, but wrong, and that we needed to find a middle way. We needed to find a distribution of responsibility so that we could conduct our lives online very much as we conduct our lives every day, with a personal responsibility, an organizational and enterprise responsibility, and yes, with the government interacting with us as and when appropriate, mostly to create a backdrop of laws and predictability so that we can go on our business confident that we can get it done and relatively speaking, with no harm either to ourselves or to others. So, over the past 4 years, the administration has done a number of things to raise awareness, working on securing.gov, the executive order Jason spoke about. But as we know with the executive order, what is it designed to do and why did the executive order come into being? It came into being because the status quo is unacceptable. It's absolutely unacceptable. So those in the private sector, those in the business community who say we don't want government involved in this at all, we will handle it. And those of us who say we would prefer to let this naturally emerge from market forces, if that were the case, I'm not sure you'd have seatbelts in your cars right now. How many of you would get into a car and drive it on a highway without seatbelts, without safety glass, without airbags or other safety features, without anti-lock brakes? How many of you would put your young driver out on the road with none of those features in an automobile? None of you would. But in 1965, when Ralph Nader wrote Unsafe at Any Speed, the argument was the market hasn't demanded it. We don't need to do these things. People aren't demanding this in their cars. They want cars that take them from point A to point B in comfort and at speed. They're not demanding safety. Well, haven't we learned anything over the past 40, 50, or 60 years? We can have both. We can get where we're going in great comfort, at relative speed, and also confident in the safety and security of our travel. So where are we in cybersecurity? The EO was designed, it was a message from the Obama administration that the status quo is not acceptable, and the president is going to instruct the government to take steps working with the private sector to create an architecture of cybersecurity that we can all begin to have some confidence in. NIST has been leading that process, very inclusive, as you know. The Department of Homeland Security has been charged with creating the operationalization of the framework. So the NIST framework is broad and inclusive, but it's not going to tell you what to do first. It's not going to tell you what to do. It says you need to detect malware when it's on your system. Okay, how? I'm an operator. How should I do that? What are the best ways that we can do that? And in part, that's what the Council on Cybersecurity was created to do, which is to provide an independent expert, we're not selling anything, platform of best practice. What is it you do? Now, this can be dangerous territory. You know, my husband and I have a rule. You get to tell me what to do or how to do it, not both. Okay, really? But it works. You know, it works for us anyway. But in this world of cybersecurity right now, we're suffering from what my colleague Tony Sager calls the fog of more. We just, you know, for those of you who study Clausewitz in the military, so you know the fog of war. We've got the fog of more in cybersecurity. There are more widgets, more secret sauce, more special ways, more if only you knew the voodoo that I do, then you would be secure. And frankly, it's not serving us very well. There's been an explosion in threat information feeds, reports, tools, alert services, security standards, threat sharing schemes. We're surrounded by all of this stuff. How do we cut through it? Well, I think in several ways. Number one, in our complex interconnected world, there's no such thing as a standalone problem for cybersecurity. Everyone's affected. And it's very difficult, if not impossible, to imagine that you can wall yourself off from a cybersecurity problem. And not even large, powerful enterprises like the U.S. government, Homeland Security, DoD, or anyone else, the best funded multinational corporations, can isolate themselves or buy their way out of this problem. We're all on the same network. Good guys, bad guys, corporations, individuals, governments, etc. So the challenge is to achieve security and maintain the openness of the internet and our ability to operate. How do we band together to do this? What are the most critical problems that are worth solving? What should an enterprise do first? So when you talk, for example, about a new cybersecurity vendor that comes in, you should ask yourself, are we doing the basic hygiene that we know right now will protect us against the most common types of intrusions? You could be doing it right now at little or no cost. So go back and ask your organizations, are we doing this? Are we whitelisting our software? What's our policy for limiting administrative access to individuals who are on the networks? Do we have a program for rapidly patching our systems and applications in real time? If we don't have those four things, the rest is commentary. The rest, as we say in my religious tradition, is commentary. So how do we instill in ourselves an understanding of these basic things? You walk into the dentist and you say, Doc, how are my teeth? You got, I feel like I need a root canal, or I've got 15 cavities. Do you brush? Do you floss? None of us floss, right? I mean, but they ask us anyway. Do you floss? Do you visit your dentist twice a year? I mean, I'll take care of your cavities, but what are you doing to take care of yourself? And so I'm full cards on the table. I'm an advocate and proponent of the 20 critical controls, the top 4 of which I just mentioned to you. Are you doing them? Is your organization doing these things right now? And these are things that non-technologists can know and understand. What's your baseline? What do your networks look like right now? What's the intrusion profile that you have? Can your CIO, CITO tell you? They should be able to. What parts of our network are most vulnerable? What kinds of intrusions are we suffering? How long does it take us to mitigate once we've detected an intrusion, repair the damage and move on? Let's baseline ourselves. And then install these 4 controls out of the 20 that I've mentioned, and I guarantee you, without indemnification of the Safety Act, may I mention, that you will see a reduction in your attack vulnerability. People say, let's talk about cyber threat. To me, the greatest cyber threat right now is unpatched existing vulnerabilities, period. It is by far the greatest threat any organization or enterprise is facing. Can you do something about it? The answer is yes. Does it cost a lot? The answer is no. Will your boss understand it? Yes. He or she will understand that. Baseline it, implement these things, and demonstrate the reduction in intrusions, and then let's talk about further protections that you might have. We are not going to provide enough security clearances. That's not, in fact, in all cases where the most important information is held anyway. every single organization represented in this room has signatures in malware that we should be able to share with each other, and that's part of what we were trying to construct at Homeland Security. The government has some too, some of which need to be sensitively handled. But there is no silver bullet. You know, looking for a silver bullet in cybersecurity is like looking for dinosaurs in Manhattan. By the way, it's not that there are no dinosaurs in Manhattan, there are no dinosaurs. Okay? So, you've come together and because you have an interest in cybersecurity. But we really need to emphasize practice. We really need to emphasize practice. With respect to technology, what is it we do? Again, the 20 critical controls are a place to begin. They will certainly be incorporated into the NIST framework. The NIST framework would certainly admit of using the 20 critical controls, but what we want the framework to do is help give us a guide and case examples of how these things work. Do those 4 things I mentioned, you'll see results. We need to do something about our workforce. I love my colleagues in Homeland Security. A lot of us in cybersecurity, I was one of the principal officials responsible for cybersecurity during my tenure at Homeland Security. I'm not, I fly a lot. I mean, do you guys fly a lot, I presume? I fly a lot. I'm not a pilot. Okay? I'm not a pilot. I've spent my fair amount of time in emergency rooms. I'm not a doctor. And, but I played one on TV. Not good enough. We need a way to distinguish the pilots. We need more pilots. And we need a way to distinguish the pilots from the frequent flyers, or those folks like me at the end of the runway admiring the takeoffs. I mean, so we really need to get serious about our workforce, because there are some serious problems. There are some serious threats and challenges and technical difficulties in cyberspace that we need to manage, and we don't yet have the workforce to do that. And we need to improve our policymaking across the board. So we've launched the Council on Cybersecurity to address these 3 areas: technology, workforce, and policy. Not-for-profit, international, expert, independent. Again, we're not selling anything. We're promoting the ongoing development. We are the home of the 20 critical controls. We will promote their ongoing development and widespread adoption. We're committed to elevating the skills and competencies of the cyber workforce, continuing the work of Mike Asante and the National Board of Information Security Examiners that began. We have a deep amount of understanding now, for example, of the kind of cybersecurity expertise that electrical engineers who are operating the grid need to have as a result of being an engineer, not being a cyber ninja. And we're seeing across the board that for other professions that we need to incorporate, endogenize into the skill set of healthcare professionals, law enforcement, electricity, of course, oil and gas, and other professions. We need to bring into those professions a greater understanding of practical cybersecurity. We're committed to that, and we're committed to developing and recommending policies that lead to measurable improvement. So we also, I should mention, are the new home to the U.S. Cyber Challenge under Karen Evans. That's a program dedicated to encouraging and promoting careers in cybersecurity for young people. So we've got a number of projects underway. We're happy to talk to you about it. We have a website online. We're going to update the controls once a year, for example. We're going to continue to build out our work on the workforce, and we're really going to break down barriers. And I'll close with this. I had a rule. I have lots of rules. I have kids. I have lots of rules. One of my rules is the Christopher Columbus rule, which is never fail to distinguish what's new from what's new to you. Never fail to distinguish what's new from what's new to you. So what we're trying to do here in cybersecurity is not unique in the human experience, but we really have to raise the bar. No single technique, no matter how sophisticated, is going to do the trick by itself. And all that needs doing can't be done alone. So as we reach for cybersecurity's higher ground, we're all in this together. And I look forward to meeting the challenge with you. Thanks very much.
Dr. Lee, thank you so much. That was an energizing and informative as well as entertaining talk. Scary in some aspects, but challenging altogether. So from this point, what we'll do is I'm going to ask each one of our panelists one question each, and that gives you time to think about the questions that you might like to ask, and for our people in the on the webcast to send those in to events@venable.com, and hopefully we'll get to lots of questions. But let me start with Jason Wool and just combining the Safety Act discussion with the NIST workshop discussion. I mean, was the Safety Act discussed at the NIST workshops?
Not extensively, and I think I probably brought it up the most of anyone in any of my groups. It just doesn't seem to be on people's radar, and I'm not exactly sure why that is, but I do know that that there haven't been too many designations and certifications granted by DHS since it came into or since it was passed in 2002, is that right? And I think that they have a little bit of a publicity problem, maybe. And I know that, for instance, I was reading the Internet Security Alliance's comments to the NIST request for information that they submitted back in, I guess, May it was. And one of the things they recommended was for Congress to change some of the terms in that statute so that it was perhaps more understandable in what it does or what it makes available. For instance, the term qualified anti-terrorism technology. You wouldn't think that cybersecurity services could fall under that definition. But so I think they have a little bit of a marketing problem, and I guess to answer the question, it wasn't raised too much at NIST at the workshops.
Thanks, Jason. And Diz, so it's been around for 10 years now. What programs, there been any programs that actually covered cybersecurity with Safety Act letters yet?
There's a couple technologies, products that are cyber related, but I think, and I was talking to Secretary Lute prior to, I think one of the challenges right now is what standards do you apply things to? Well, that's what the whole point of the framework is. So you have a standard, you have a baseline that folks' cybersecurity programs can be compared against and determine whether they're effective or not. So I think that's been one of the challenges, that you simply don't have a recognized baseline to go with. Previously, there was no regulation, there were no standards, so, or at least well-recognized standards like NIST is putting out now.
And Dr. Lute, if I could turn to your discussion then. So you were integrally involved with the Cyber Policy Administration, with the development of the executive order and things surrounding it. Is it envisioned, do you think there is a possibility for additional regulation that would go with incentives, or how do you see that progressing?
I certainly think there's possibility. I think there is a near certainty there's going to be legislation in cybersecurity. One of the things that's very real, I think, is that governments across the board, including our own, is moving into cyberspace now with a very determined purpose. Governments, whatever you say about them, have the responsibility to protect their societies from vulnerabilities. We are vulnerable in cyberspace, so that's why you see the government acting. What role should it play? That's in part the debates that we're undergoing right now as a society. Again, the Safety Act was designed to encourage those who were developing technology and services to prevent against the terrorist attacks to be able to do so confident that they could experiment and innovate in a way with some degree of protection. I don't think it's just a question of getting the word out. I think it's a question of understanding how do you define a technology that is anti-terrorist in nature in this space. I think it's possible to do. And how do you benchmark its performance? I mean, on the 4 critical controls that I talked to you about, you can benchmark their performance. The Australians have done it in a controlled test, admittedly, relatively small, but nevertheless, they've done it. We need to do those kinds of things first. The Safety Act is not designed to protect a company against cyber intrusion. It's designed, if companies are in this space and if they pursue Safety Act, designations and certifications, if they have offerings in this space, there might be potential here. But frankly, I think legislation ought to begin with requiring threshold hygiene to be performed. And I think the analogy that we can all live with, frankly, is automotive safety. Now, I know it's unpopular to say, but it's equally unpopular that if I go to your site, my identity or my information is potentially compromised, and you can throw up your hands and say, well, you didn't insist on security, you insisted on buying this soap. So we have a long way to go, but I think legislation is in our future.
All right. Thank you, ma'am. So if I could open it up then to the people that are here in the room, and if you would raise your hand, we'll get you a microphone so that the people on the webcast can hear you, the questions in the room. All right? Jeff Goldthorpe, a former colleague from FCC.
Hi, for Secretary Lute. Secretary, we've talked some about metrics today, and we've talked, I think even today, a little bit about outcome-oriented metrics, in other words, performance metrics versus adoption. So adoption of the framework versus measuring the effectiveness of the framework in achieving certain outcomes that can be determined in advance. And I'm wondering what your opinion is of those two. Do you think that one can be a surrogate for the other? Do you think that adoption is an effective surrogate for performance-based metrics, or do we need both?
That's a good question. Sorry, thanks. It's a good question, particularly in the area where we have uncertainty and we're trying to accumulate, hard data that gives us confidence that the measures that we're advocating actually work. And so, and there are a number of parallels in our everyday life. Do you change your oil regularly? What preventive value can we assign to that? I mean, the automotive industry doesn't assign a preventive value to changing your oil regularly. It just says if you don't and your engine seizes up, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry about that. You should have changed your oil regularly. So I think we're in a phase where we know enough now to advocate the adoption for, and you've heard me say it now multiple times, of the top 4 of the 20 critical controls, and that they measurably reduce the most common attacks that every enterprise is suffering. So it's for an enterprise to go back and say, well, where are we now? Are these in place? Yes or no? Let's put them in place and let's look at our profile once they've been operating for a while. And if we can reduce our attack, that tells me as an outsider several things. Number one, the management's got a grip on that enterprise and its understanding. I mean, one problem that I've heard from business leaders about the NIST process is that, they're not in business to detect, prevent, mitigate, respond, recover. They're in the business to sell services or sell widgets. And what they want to understand is what are the things they need to do and do first to reduce their vulnerability to a cyber problem.
All right. Thank you. This one from the web to Dislocaria. If you receive designation or certification under the Safety Act, will you be protected from on a cyber attack by a foreign state government or only attacks by terrorists?
That's a great question. The Safety Act is intended and designed to deal with acts of terrorism. Whether it's state-sponsored terrorism would be something that you would have to make those arguments in court. I was talking with someone previously about an organization like Hezbollah. It's a terrorist organization, but a quasi-government entity. I'm not sure how that would play out, unfortunately.
All right. Other questions here in the room, then? Yes, sir. You would just wait for you have the microphone. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Okay, I was just wondering that this.
You mind identifying yourself?
Oh yes, Adam Gianella, intern at the Chertoff Group. I was just wondering which critical infrastructure sectors would be most or least likely to be impacted by this framework, and how worried would these companies be if they had to comply if these if the framework is adopted into law?
I guess that's for me. It would apply to, Homeland Security envisioned that this would apply to all of the critical infrastructures. The voluntary participation would apply to all. There are some that more of the nation feels consequentially affected by: energy, for example, finance. Not to say that the others aren't important; they are. I've also heard, particularly when I was in government, complaints, I guess that's the word, or concerns by business. Some of them don't want to be designated critical infrastructure. So they want the clout, they want the reach, they want the revenue, but they don't want the responsibility, is what I would ask. Really? Well, that's not what they're saying. Okay, what are they saying? And if a breach happens that's consequential, that takes down a portion of the grid or that compromises banking identity information, resulting in millions of dollars or billions of dollars lost. But more importantly, the loss of information that can be individuated to you and me and to people with negative consequences, then, what's the explanation then? How do they possibly justify not pursuing a regime of cybersecurity to ensure that the basics are being accomplished? I don't get it.
Thank you. If I could follow up on that, I mean, one of the things that the Executive Order 13636 talks about is the designation of certain industries or critical industry as at greatest risk, having a national or regional, significant impact. So, what are the implications of being designated at greatest risk? What do you think was the intention of that?
So the intention of the executive order is to take action in the face of a lot of swirl that was going on, in the face of Congress's inability to pass legislation a year ago, and a determination by the administration, by the president, and by those of us who are actively supporting a greater and more aggressive posture on cybersecurity to get people in the game. The designations, what is critical infrastructure? There are 16 critical infrastructure sectors. People know where they are. In some of the sectors, like the chemical sector, for example, there's tiering that doesn't exist in all of the critical infrastructures. There's some that argue that, for example, dams. Every dam in the country is critical to a population that it serves, which are critical to the continued economic and social prosperity of this country as an overall proposition. So the point of designation and the point of highlighting risk was to say everyone's at risk. I think we're well past the stage of saying, have you heard of the word cybersecurity? Do you understand that you're vulnerable and that intrusions, you probably already got malware on your systems? I think we're past that phase. We're now at the stage where companies want to know, where do I invest? What do I do? What's my exposure? This is no longer a theoretical question. This is about what we do.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Alan Powler of the SANS Institute.
So there are a lot of people in the room who are attorneys and some attorneys and non-attorneys who work for associations, a bunch of them in the room. I've known them for years. They work for companies who would very much like government to disappear in this arena, and anything they can do to help that makes them heroes. Let's say they buy your argument that there are some things that the companies really ought to do, but they're being paid to basically stop government from doing anything. So what would you advise them, if they buy into the idea that maybe they'd like to be part of the solution, not just make money off cybersecurity? What could they do that would enable their clients to act affirmatively without crossing their clients on this area of keep government out of our world? Is there sort of a path through the maze that isn't governmental?
Well, I think there's certainly a path. From my point of view, I don't know where my colleagues end up. Number one, you want something to do, support the Council on Cybersecurity. We're independent. We're not selling anything. What we're about is best practice, and we are opening our doors for founding sponsorship. So more to follow on that. But what you can do is model best behavior. Baseline yourselves, adopt these measures, and let's write up the case study and let's celebrate your success. Let's put that word out there. This is how you can do it on your own. Let's get the machines in the game to begin with, because almost universally they're not yet. They could be doing a lot more. And you could be moving those much more expensive human resources into problems that really matter. So I think there are pathways in terms of practice that can be modeled, showcased. We're prepared to do that. And we have pretty extensive reach globally. And we, for our part, have the ability, again, if you're non-governmental is what you seek, there's a lot of partners out there that are looking to find exactly that pathway, which is how do we demonstrate best practice on our own?
And if I could add to that, her answer is complete. But to your point about why would they change the polarity on that, I think the germ of that answer is actually in the executive order. There has to be some incentive. There has to be that interaction that Secretary Lute mentioned with the government that actually encourages, incentivizes them. And to me, ultimately, the executive order will do part of that, but the most of it will probably have to come with legislation. And so I say that to set up this question to Secretary Lute. You mentioned that you thought there would be legislation within our lifetime. I might mention there's some young people in here that might be living a lot longer than I do. But I mean, what do you see on the horizon for legislation?
I just want to say something about this whole notion of incentives. You know, we need incentives. How about responsible business practice as an incentive? How about, you know, being able to assure your client base and your customers that you are doing everything you can? If someone were to walk into your boardroom and say, is this company doing everything it can do to keep my information and my identity secure? To preserve our investment as shareholders in this corporation? Are you doing the basic things? Are you whitelisting your software? Are you limiting administrative privileges? Are you patching in near real time your systems and your software? And if you can't answer yes to those, then you're not. Then you're just not. You can say, well, we've hired the most expensive or what we think is the biggest or the flashiest or the newest. That doesn't give the same assurity that these basic measures would do of preventing the common attacks. You know, in terms of legislation, for those who say we want to keep government out, I mean, you know, we've all have examples of this in our everyday lives. You know, remember that old commercial, you can pay me now, you can pay me later? You can do the things right now that demonstrate that we're raising the bar in terms of our own performance, or government will step in. Government is going to, this government has already committed to becoming more involved because, quite frankly, we're at an unacceptable level of vulnerability, and the market is not taking care of that. Not that it doesn't have a role, it does. So in terms of specifics in legislation, you know, I think you know, there have been dozens of bills at any one time on the floor. There was one, you know, two in particular over the course of time. But things change. Our understanding, our sophistication is changing. And if anything, you cannot accuse this government, either the executive branch or Congress, of not being inclusive with the private sector and saying, what are the best ideas that we should insist on right now? But you don't need Congress to do them anyway.
This one from the web, Dr. Lute, if NSA can't protect itself, what hope do private companies have? And it says as a tagline to that, maybe refocus the question on human risk versus technical risk.
So I know it proves too irresistible a target for everyone, but I heard myself say several times, limited administrative privileges at a minimum. These four of the 20 critical controls that I've been talking about work. They work today, and it's not impenetrable. I was talking to a CEO of a Fortune 50 company, and I said, how often do you talk to your CIO? I said, do you talk to your CIO very often, your CITO every month? And he said, well, you know, I don't speak dolphin. You know? So when those guys start talking, it's all, you know? You know, we used to, when I was a young officer in the Army, we had a branch of the Signal Corps intelligence, which was called 05 Hotels. They were DIT dots. They copied code. They were very special people. But so I was reminded of that. But, you know, there are common, and, you know, we all have vulnerability. We should understand our networks. We should understand who's on them. We should understand the basic way we're being penetrated. And we should understand these basic steps that really constitute brushing, flossing, and visiting your dentist twice a year. And you'll get measurable results.
Thank you. And with all respect to whoever asked the question, as someone who had a son who worked for NSA for a while, I certainly think they're the best in the world. So. Other questions from in the room here? Yes, ma'am.
My name is Bonnie, and I'm from the Aerospace Corporation. And I'd just like to follow up on that point. I mean, when you study network security, you know that the most vulnerable people on your network are your system admins and your network engineer. You learn that. But often organizations don't actually practice that. they knew it, and they didn't. That was a vulnerability, and they didn't address their vulnerability.
Right.
Oh, I mean, amen. And it's not that they're bad people. This is not that case. But what we've seen over the course of, I started out my professional life as a signal officer in the Army. Could I do that job today that a signal lieutenant has to do? The answer is no. It's become far more technologically sophisticated. We're placing great demands on our sysadmins. We're placing great demands on our technical people. Are we investing in their training? Are we investing in their professionalization? There was a study just came out from the National Science Foundation. No, the Academy of Sciences. National Academy of Sciences. It says, it's the field. It's not possible to professionalize this field yet. It's still in its infancy. Seriously? Seriously? The motto is not aim low.
Yeah. Other questions? Back here.
Hi, I'm Cynthia Musselman from Secure Mission Solutions. My question is that during your comments, ma'am, you mentioned that rapid response, as we've seen in certified systems on an IT basis, is going to be an important thing to carry forward. But when we're talking about ICS systems, control systems, rapid patching to those infrastructures could be incredibly dangerous without understanding the implications or potential implications. Do you see a need or requirement for the government to create laboratories to allow testing of potential patches to these infrastructure elements?
So I'm not a technologist. I'll defer. But I will tell you that when I was at Homeland Security, one of my colleagues, John Streupert, maybe well known to many of you, came to me with a program of continuous diagnostics and monitoring, which was the deployment of sensors around the network supported by algorithms that could interpret the threats that were coming in, prioritize them, and then institute an automatic near real-time patching for those systems. So is near real-time patching dangerous? I'll leave that to the experts. But is our unpatched vulnerabilities the greatest threat to your cybersecurity right now? The answer is yes.
Other questions? One other question that I would have for you, because it comes up, and so I know you may actually grow tired, but do you ever see, and you obviously have had access to confidential classified information, we're not asking for that, but do you see a potential for the cyber Armageddon, cyber Pearl Harbor? Is it inevitable? Has that threat been overblown, or is there some vulnerability for something that would be catastrophic?
I don't use those physical world analogies. I think they obscure rather than clarify. Does the potential exist in cyberspace for very dangerous things to happen? Yes. Are we going to be able to run the cybersecurity of this country like an Intel program? No. We cannot build enough SCIFs. We cannot issue enough clearances. It's beside the point anyway. There's an awful lot of vulnerability that we face that's unclassified in your world every single day, and we need to protect against them. Are there capabilities and adversaries of sophistication that can introduce highly consequential physical world effects? The answer is yes, and that's why we need to raise the bar in our professionalism of our cybersecurity workforce. We need to get the machines in the game with the adoption of these measures and the 20 critical controls, and we need to focus on the rest of the environment that permits, at the moment, offense to be at the advantage.
Thank you. Other questions in the room? There in the back. Okay. Our partner, Keir. Sorry.
Thanks, Chris. Keir Bancroft from Venable. First, there was an earlier question about having labs available. I think NIST is establishing a cyber federally funded research and development center this year. I think this year and going into next year, that may be one example of a lab that may be available. But one question for the Secretary was, how is the framework and the process of developing the framework being viewed on the international stage? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, it's actually, I'm just back from Europe. There's a great deal of awareness. There's you may not like where your government is on cybersecurity, but it is I think inarguably one of the leading governments globally on awareness of and encouraging practice and engaging the private sector on the question of cybersecurity. There are other governments, for example, Estonia, where e-governance, they've managed to crack a lot of problems, in some cases 20 years ago, that we're just wrestling with now. Some other governments, Sweden, a few other governments around the world, Australia, for example, very serious on cybersecurity, the Brits, the French, and others. What they're looking at, though, is everybody's looking for an example of how to get this basically right, knowing that governments are not going to be given exclusive responsibility for cybersecurity. There are some governments, frankly, who want that, in part because there are some governments that believe information in the hands of the people is a dangerous thing. And so there is a big contest right now for the future of the internet on the governance side of the house. Are they paying attention to every NIST working group? And no, but I think when NIST comes out, I think particularly if the framework is supported with use examples, use cases, and hard-edge recommendations about what companies can do first, I think that's going to have a lot of traction. But this is an opportunity for that, not just to say, here's the catalog of things that you might buy. What in this catalog, is best for me? What should I want to want? I mean, if we can bridge that gap using the framework and use cases, I think it's going to have a powerful effect globally.
So I'd like to thank each of you for coming today, for those who joined us on the web for coming. I'll express appreciation to the staff at Venable here that did such a great job at putting this together, and from the lunch to the sound system and everything that went with it. We appreciate the various members of the government who were here and the press, and particularly I appreciate my colleagues on the panel here, Jason Wool and Diz here at Diz Lacaria here at Venable. And if you would help me join in thanking them and Secretary Lute for that outstanding presentation. Thank you, man. With that, we'll adjourn.